There are moments in a woman's life when she discovers precisely how far she is willing to fall, and for Eleanor Ashworth, that moment came on a rain-soaked evening in early autumn, when she found herself running through the darkness with her heart pounding against her ribs and her thin dress already soaked through to the skin, the water streaming down her face, mingling with tears she refused to acknowledge as she fled from the coaching inn where Mr. Frederick Dalton had cornered her in the upstairs hallway, his breath sour with wine, and his hands grasping at her sleeves as he informed her that her position as his mother's companion came with certain expectations, certain accommodations that a woman in her reduced circumstances ought to be grateful to provide, and Eleanor had done the only thing left to her. She had driven her knee upward with all the force her desperate terror could muster and run, while he doubled over cursing her name, run into the storm that had been threatening all evening, and now unleashed itself upon the countryside with a fury that matched her own. And she did not know where she was going, only that she could not go back, could never go back. For even if Mrs. Dalton believed her account over her sons, Eleanor knew with the bone-deep certainty of a woman who had learned hard lessons about the world's cruelty that she would be dismissed without reference, cast out into a world that had already shown her how little mercy it possessed for gentlewomen who had fallen from grace. And so she ran until her lungs burned and her legs trembled, until she saw through the sheets of rain the dark shape of a fine carriage waiting outside an estate she did not recognize, its horses stamping impatiently, its driver nowhere to be seen, and some desperate instinct drove her toward it, her frozen fingers fumbling with the door handle until it gave way, and she tumbled inside onto velvet seats that received her sodden, shivering form like an embrace. And she meant only to hide for a moment, only to catch her breath and wait for the worst of the storm to pass, before continuing on to somewhere, anywhere. But the velvet was so soft beneath her cheek, and the darkness so complete, and her exhaustion so profound, that her eyes closed of their own accord, and she slept, truly slept, for the first time in months, without dreaming of Clarence Pemberton's cruel smile, or her father's grave, or the pitying stares of strangers, until she became aware, slowly, of movement beneath her, of the rocking rhythm of wheels on a road, and of a scent that wrapped around her like something half-remembered from a better life, sandalwood and leather with an undertone of wood smoke. And for one confused, suspended moment, she felt inexplicably safe. And then her eyes flew open, and she found herself staring across the carriage's dim interior at a man who watched her with storm-cloud eyes that revealed nothing of his thoughts, a man whose broad shoulders seemed to fill the space, whose dark hair was touched with rain, whose face was all hard planes and sharp angles, and whose voice, when he spoke, was deep and dry and utterly without warmth as he said, "You are not my driver, you are not my valet, you are, in fact, a woman asleep in my carriage, and I confess myself curious as to how this situation arose." And Eleanor's hand flew to her throat, reaching for the locket that was no longer there, the locket she had sold 6 months ago to pay the last of her father's debts, and she understood with terrible clarity that she had escaped one impossible situation only to land in another, soaked and dishevelled and completely compromised in the private carriage of a stranger whose identity she did not know, but whose bearing spoke of wealth and power, and a complete lack of patience for women who appeared uninvited in his carriage, like drowned and desperate ghosts. The silence that stretched between them was not the comfortable quiet of companionship, but rather the taut stillness before a storm breaks. And Eleanor found herself acutely aware of every detail of the man before her, the way the carriage lantern cast shadows across the sharp planes of his face, the breadth of his shoulders that seemed to fill the space between them, the intensity of those storm-cloud eyes that watched her with an expression she could not decipher, and she knew she must speak, must explain herself. Yet the words tangled in her throat like threads pulled too tight, and so she began with the only truth she had left, her voice emerging smaller than she intended. "I am not a thief, Your Grace. I am simply a woman who ran out of choices. I apologize for inconveniencing you. If you would stop the carriage, I will trouble you no further." And even as she spoke, her hand rose unbidden to her throat, to the hollow where her mother's locket had once rested, sold 6 months past to settle the last of her father's debts. And she watched his eyes track the gesture, noting it, cataloguing it in some way she did not understand. And when he spoke, his voice was clipped and commanding, yet somehow lacking the cruelty she had braced herself to receive. "In this storm? Don't be absurd." And lightning chose that moment to illuminate the carriage interior, throwing his features into sharp relief, the hard line of his jaw, the slight furrow between his brows, the way his gaze never wavered from her face. And Eleanor drew a shaking breath and continued, because she had learned that truth, however painful, was preferable to the slow poison of secrets. "My name is Eleanor Ashworth. I am the daughter of the late Robert Ashworth, whose investments failed rather spectacularly 2 years ago. Perhaps you heard of it. The scandal was considerable. I have been working as a companion to Mrs. Dalton these past 8 months, and tonight I fled because her son—" She stopped, swallowed, forced herself to continue with the quiet dignity that was all she had left. "Her son made it." Clear that my position came with expectations I was unwilling to fulfill. I ran. I found your carriage. I meant only to shelter for a moment. I did not intend to fall asleep. I did not intend any of this. And she watched something flicker in his expression at the mention of her father's name, something she could not quite identify. Recognition, perhaps, though not the sneering recognition she had grown accustomed to seeing when people learned who she was. And he was silent for a long moment, the rain drumming against the carriage roof, the thunder rolling across the countryside like a warning or a promise. And then he did something that surprised her utterly. He shrugged off his greatcoat, the movement efficient and without ceremony, and held it out to her. And she realized only then that she was shivering, had been shivering since she woke, her thin dress still damp against her skin. And she took the coat with trembling fingers and wrapped it around herself, and the scent of sandalwood and leather and wood smoke enveloped her like an embrace, and for the first time in months, perhaps years, she felt something that might have been warmth. "You will come to Blackwell Manor tonight," he said. And it was not a question, but a statement, a command issued by a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Tomorrow we will determine what is to be done. You cannot wander the countryside in a storm, and I will not have it said that I abandoned a gentlewoman to the elements, whatever her circumstances." And Eleanor opened her mouth to protest, to insist that she could not possibly impose upon him further, that propriety demanded she refuse. But he silenced her with a look that brooked no argument. "Propriety ceased to be relevant, Miss Ashworth, when you fell asleep in my carriage." And there was something almost dry in his tone, something that might have been humour in another man, and Eleanor found herself nodding, found herself accepting, because she had no other choice, and because something in his manner, brusque though it was, suggested that this stranger with his storm-cloud eyes and commanding presence might be the first person in 2 years who did not look at her and see only her disgrace. Blackwell Manor rose from the darkness like something out of a fever dream, its windows glowing with warm light that seemed almost impossible after the cold and the rain and the terror of the evening, and Eleanor found herself handed down from the carriage by a footman whose face she did not see, guided through a grand entrance hall whose details blurred before her exhausted eyes, and then delivered into the capable hands of a woman who introduced herself as Mrs. Thornton, the housekeeper, a woman of perhaps 50 years with sharp eyes that missed nothing and a manner that brooked no argument. And Eleanor heard the Duke's voice somewhere behind her, clipped and commanding. "See that she has everything she requires, Mrs. Thornton. We will speak in the morning." And then he was gone, his footsteps receding down some distant corridor, and Eleanor was alone with this stranger, who looked at her sodden dress and tangled hair and bare throat, and saw, somehow, not a woman who had fallen beyond redemption, but simply a woman who needed care. And within the hour, Eleanor found herself bathed in water so hot it made her skin flush pink, wrapped in a nightgown of fine cotton that was too large for her, but impossibly soft, seated before a fire in a guest chamber more beautiful than any room she had occupied since her father's death, with a tray of soup and bread and tea before her that Mrs. Thornton insisted she finish before sleeping, and the housekeeper tucked the covers around her with a gentleness that made Eleanor's eyes sting with tears she refused to shed, saying quietly, "Rest now, miss. Whatever brought you here, you're safe tonight. His Grace is many things, but he is not a man who turns away those in need." And then she was gone too, and Eleanor was alone in the silence, alone with the lavender-scented sheets that felt like clouds beneath her weary body, alone with her thoughts that circled like ravens around the wreckage of her life. For she had no position now, no references, no family, no prospects, nothing but the £3.07 tucked into the pocket of her ruined dress. And she thought of Clarence, of his golden hair and his easy smile, and the way he had looked at her once, as though she were precious, before he learned that her father's fortune had evaporated like morning mist, before he had stood in that ballroom and announced to the world that she was not worth keeping, and her hand rose to her throat where the locket should have been, her mother's locket with the miniature portrait inside, sold to a jeweller in London for £12, that had gone to pay a debt her father had owed to a man who threatened to have his grave disturbed if the sum was not settled. And she curled into the soft bed and pulled the covers to her chin, making herself small the way she had learned to do in Mrs. Dalton's house, taking up as little space as possible, asking for nothing, expecting nothing. And she made herself a promise in the darkness, a vow spoken only to herself and to whatever God might still be listening to the prayers of ruined women, that whatever tomorrow brought, she would accept it with dignity, that if the Duke offered help, she would take it gratefully. But she would not hope for too much. She would not allow herself to want what she could not have. She would be grateful and practical and wise, and she would not, could not, must not ever allow herself to love again. For she had loved Clarence Pemberton, and it had destroyed her, and she could not survive another heartbreak, not now, not ever. And so she closed her eyes and let the exhaustion claim her. And if she dreamed, she did not remember it. Come morning. Morning light streamed through the tall windows of Henry's study, casting long rectangles of gold across the worn Persian carpet, and illuminating the dust motes that drifted lazily through the air. And Eleanor stood before the massive oak desk with her hands clasped before her, and her spine held straight despite the trembling in her limbs, for she had prepared herself for this moment, had rehearsed the words of gratitude she would offer when he pressed a few coins into her palm and sent her on her way, had already begun calculating how long she might stretch whatever sum he provided, how many weeks she could survive in some modest boarding house while she searched for another position, another household that might take a chance on a woman without references, without connections, without anything but her dignity and her determination to survive. And yet the Duke of Ashworth did not reach for his coin purse, did not summon a servant to show her out, but instead regarded her with those storm-cloud eyes that seemed to see far more than she wished to reveal. And the room smelled of leather and old books, a masculine sanctuary that spoke of generations of power and privilege. And Eleanor found herself acutely aware of her borrowed dress, of the way she did not belong in this world of wealth and consequence. And when he finally spoke, his voice was clipped and businesslike, as though he were discussing a matter of estate management rather than her entire future. "I find myself in need of a wife, Miss Ashworth. My aunt has made it abundantly clear that I must marry and produce an heir, and I have neither the patience nor the inclination for the marriage mart, for the simpering debutantes and their scheming mothers who see only my title and my fortune." And Eleanor's breath caught in her throat, her hand rising unbidden to touch the hollow where her locket had once rested, because surely she had misheard, surely he could not mean what his words seemed to suggest, and he continued, his gaze never wavering from her face. "You require security and protection. I require a wife who will manage my household competently and appear at the necessary social functions without causing me undue aggravation. I am proposing an arrangement, Miss Ashworth, a marriage of convenience that would benefit us both." And Eleanor heard herself ask, her voice emerging smaller than she intended, "Why me, Your Grace? Surely any woman would accept such an offer from a man of your standing." And something flickered in his expression, something she could not quite name, and he said, "Your father once did me a kindness, years ago, when I was young and foolish, and in need of funds my own father would not provide. Robert Ashworth lent me what I needed, and asked nothing in return, but my word that I would repay him when I was able. I did repay him, but I find that some debts cannot be settled with coin alone." And Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes, at this unexpected mention of her father, at the knowledge that he had been kind even when she had not known it, and Henry continued, his voice softening almost imperceptibly, "You are intelligent, Miss Ashworth. I observed that much in our brief conversation. You are dignified despite your circumstances, and you will not bore me with idle chatter or vapid concerns. I believe we could deal well together." And when Eleanor still hesitated, still struggling to comprehend how her life had shifted so dramatically in the space of a single night, he rose from behind his desk and crossed to stand before her, and his voice dropped low as he said, "I give you my word, Miss Ashworth, that you will be safe under my protection. I will ask nothing of you that you do not freely give. You will want for nothing, and no one will ever humiliate you again while you bear my name." And the fierce conviction in his voice broke something loose in Eleanor's chest, some wall she had built around her battered heart, and she found herself nodding, found herself saying yes, and when he extended his hand to seal their agreement, his grip was warm and firm, and she felt the calluses on his palm, the hands of a man who worked rather than merely inherited, and she thought, "I will be grateful, I will be dutiful, I will be the perfect wife in all practical ways, but I will not love him. I cannot survive another heartbreak." And she held fast to that promise, even as something in his storm-cloud eyes made her wonder if keeping it would prove far more difficult than she had ever imagined. The wedding had been a quiet affair, almost perfunctory in its simplicity, conducted in the small chapel on the Blackwell estate with only a vicar, Mrs. Thornton, and the elderly groundskeeper as witnesses, and Eleanor had spoken her vows in a voice that did not tremble, had felt Henry's hand close around hers as he slid a simple gold band onto her finger, had signed her name in the parish register, and become, in the space of an hour, the Duchess of Ashworth, a title that sat upon her shoulders like a garment made for someone else. Someone who had not spent the past 2 years learning to make herself small and unobtrusive. Someone who had not sold her mother's locket to pay her father's debts. Someone who had not fled through the rain from a man's unwanted hands. And now a week had passed since that strange and solemn ceremony. A week in which Eleanor had thrown herself into the task of learning her new household with a determination that bordered on desperation. For if she could not be a wife in the truest sense of the word, she could at least be a competent mistress of Blackwell Manor, could earn her place through usefulness, if not through affection, and she had won over the kitchen staff with her genuine interest in their work, had charmed the housemaids with her quiet kindness, and her refusal to stand on ceremony, had spent hours with Mrs. Thornton reviewing accounts and menus, and the intricate social calendar of a ducal household, and through it all, Henry had been courteous, but distant, appearing at meals to exchange polite conversation about estate matters and the weather, then retreating to his study with a formal bow, that left Eleanor feeling oddly bereft, and she told herself this was what she wanted. This was precisely the arrangement they had agreed upon, a marriage of convenience that asked nothing of her heart. And yet she found herself listening for his footsteps in the corridor, found herself glancing toward the door of whatever room she occupied, found herself wondering what he was thinking behind those storm-cloud eyes that revealed so little. And it was on the 7th evening of her marriage that she wandered into the library, seeking a book to occupy the long hours before sleep, the room smelling of old paper and leather, and something else, something that made her think of safety, of warmth, of the night she had woken in his carriage wrapped in his coat, and the late afternoon light gilded the spines of hundreds of volumes as she trailed her fingers along them, searching for something that might quiet the restless ache in her chest. And her hand fell upon a worn copy of Persuasion, its spine cracked from much reading, and she pulled it from the shelf with a small smile, thinking of her mother who had loved this story, who had read it aloud to Eleanor on rainy afternoons, and she was so absorbed in the memory that she did not notice the worn edge of the carpet until her foot caught upon it, and she stumbled forward with a startled cry. And then there were hands catching her elbow, steadying her, warm and strong through the thin fabric of her sleeve, and she looked up to find Henry standing before her, having entered so quietly she had not heard him, and time seemed to suspend itself as his fingers remained curved around her arm, as the heat of his palms seeped through to her skin, as his dark grey eyes met hers with an intensity that stole her breath, and the moment stretched between them, 2 seconds, 3, an eternity contained in the space of a heartbeat, before he released her abruptly and stepped back, his jaw tightening in that way she had come to recognize as his tell of discomfort, and his voice was clipped when he spoke. "You should have that carpet repaired." And then he was gone, striding from the library before she could gather her scattered wits to respond, and Eleanor stood alone among the books with her heart racing and her hand rising unbidden to touch the place on her arm where his hand had been, and she found herself touching that same spot throughout the evening, unconsciously, as though she could hold on to the ghost of his warmth. And later, when Mrs. Thornton brought her evening tea, the housekeeper mentioned with studied casualness that His Grace had specifically requested this particular blend be stocked, a blend Eleanor had mentioned only once, in passing, on her first morning at the manor, and Eleanor stared at the cup in her hands and did not know what to do with this information, did not know what to make of a man who noticed such small things and acted upon them without announcement. And she thought of his hand on her elbow, of the way he had held her a moment too long, of the words he had spoken before fleeing. "Henry, you are my wife. You may use my name." And something fluttered in her chest, something dangerous, something she had promised herself she would never feel again. The morning dawned crisp and golden, the kind of autumn day that seemed to hold its breath between seasons, and Eleanor was sitting in the morning room reviewing the week's menus with Mrs. Thornton when Henry appeared in the doorway, his riding coat still bearing traces of the early mist, and announced without preamble that he would be visiting the tenant farms to address a drainage issue that had been troubling the eastern fields, and then, as if the thought had only just occurred to him, though Eleanor suspected otherwise, he added that she might accompany him if she wished, for she was the Duchess now, and the tenants should know her face. And something in the careful way he did not quite meet her eyes told her this invitation had been considered far more deliberately than his casual tone suggested. And so Eleanor found herself seated across from him in the carriage as it wound through lanes bordered by hedgerows, turned amber and russet, watching the countryside roll past in a tapestry of harvest fields and ancient oaks, while stealing glances at her husband's stern profile, at the way the morning light caught the sharp planes of his jaw and the slight furrow between his brows as he reviewed papers he had brought along, and they spoke little during the journey. But the silence was not uncomfortable, had ceased to be uncomfortable somewhere in the past 10 days, without Eleanor quite noticing when the change had occurred, and when they arrived at the Barton farm, the smell of hay and wood smoke greeted them, honest country sense that reminded Eleanor of simpler times, and she watched as Henry dismounted and strode toward the farmer who waited by the gate, expecting to see the cold formality he showed to visitors at the manor. But instead, she witnessed something that made her breath catch in her throat. For Henry spoke to Mr. Barton not as a lord addressing a subordinate, but as one man consulting another about matters of mutual concern, asking questions and listening to the answers with genuine attention. And when they entered the cottage and Mrs. Barton apologized for the humble surroundings, Henry waved away her concerns with a gentleness Eleanor had never seen him display in company. And then he noticed the child, a small girl of perhaps 5 years, lying on a pallet near the fire, with fever-bright eyes and a doll clutched to her thin chest. And what happened next would remain etched in Eleanor's memory long after the details of that day had faded. For Henry crossed the room and knelt in the dirt beside the child without a thought for his fine clothes, and his voice, when he spoke, was so tender that Eleanor felt tears prick unexpectedly at her eyes. "What is your doll's name?" he asked, and the child whispered, "Charlotte." And Henry nodded gravely and said, "Ah, Charlotte, a fine name. She looks cold, doesn't she, here? This will keep her warm until you're both feeling better." And he drew his own handkerchief from his pocket, the fine linen monogrammed with his initials, and wrapped it carefully around the doll, with hands that were surprisingly gentle for their size. And the child's face transformed with a tremulous smile, and Henry promised to send his own physician before the day was out, and Eleanor, standing near the carriage where she had retreated to give them privacy, felt something shift in her chest, some wall she had built around her wounded heart developing a crack she had not authorized. For this was not the cold, distant Duke that society whispered about. This was a man who knelt in the dirt to comfort a frightened child, and gave away his handkerchief to warm a doll. And on the ride home, when she thanked him for his kindness, he seemed almost uncomfortable with the praise, his jaw tightening as he looked out the window rather than at her. "She was frightened," he said, his voice clipped in that way she now recognized as his defense against feeling too much. "It cost me nothing." But Eleanor saw the truth that he could not, or would not, speak aloud, that it had cost him something, had cost him the armor of his reputation, and the distance he maintained so carefully, and he had not hesitated for even a moment, and she found herself thinking of the promise she had made to herself, the promise not to love him, and wondered with a flutter of something that might have been fear, or might have been hope, whether that promise was already beginning to crumble. 2 weeks had passed since Eleanor had spoken her vows in the small chapel. 2 weeks since she had signed her name in the parish register and become a duchess. And she had begun to establish a rhythm to her days that brought her something approaching contentment, a morning routine that started with breakfast in the sunny morning room, where light poured through tall windows and gilded the silver tea service, followed by a walk through the gardens where the last roses of autumn clung stubbornly to their stems, and then the pleasant business of managing a household that had begun to feel, against all her expectations, like something that might one day be called home. And Henry had taken to joining her for breakfast more often now, appearing in the doorway with his dark hair still damp from his morning ride, settling into the chair across from her with a nod of greeting that had become familiar, if not yet warm. And they would speak of practical matters over toast and coffee, of the drainage project that was progressing well, of letters that required response, of the social obligations that loomed on the horizon. And Eleanor found herself looking forward to these mornings with an anticipation she did not care to examine too closely, found herself listening for the sound of his boots in the corridor, found herself noticing the way the morning light softened the stern lines of his face, and brought out flecks of silver in his storm-grey eyes. And it was on such a morning, with sunlight streaming through the windows, and the smell of toast and strong coffee filling the air, that Wellington made his appearance. The elderly hunting hound, whose grey muzzle and rheumy eyes spoke of many years of faithful service, padding into the breakfast room with the determined air of a dog who knew precisely where he wished to be, and had no intention of being dissuaded. and that place, it seemed, was at Eleanor's side, for the hound crossed directly to her chair and settled his heavy head upon her knee, with a sigh of profound satisfaction, his tail thumping gently against the carpet as she reached down instinctively to scratch behind his ears. And Henry's voice cut through the peaceful scene with a note of command that Eleanor had come to recognize as his way of managing a world that did not always bend to his will. "Wellington, come," he said, and the dog's tail continued its contented rhythm, without the slightest acknowledgement that his master had spoken. "Wellington," Henry repeated, his tone sharpening, and still the hound remained precisely where he was, gazing up at Eleanor with an expression of such devoted adoration that she felt her lips twitch despite her best efforts at composure. And when she glanced across the table, she saw Henry's face, saw the great Duke of Ashworth confronted with the absolute mutiny of his own dog, saw the exasperation warring with something that looked almost like bewilderment in his expression, and the laugh escaped her before she could stop it, bubbling up from somewhere deep in her chest, genuine and unguarded and utterly beyond her control. The first time she had laughed like this since before her father's death, since before Clarence and the humiliation and the long grey months of simply surviving. And Henry stared at her, arrested, his coffee cup frozen halfway to his lips, and something shifted in his face, something cracked open behind those guarded eyes, and then his mouth curved into a smile that transformed him entirely, not the polite social expression she had seen him offer to visitors, but something real and warm, that crinkled the corners of his eyes and made him look younger, made him look like a man who had once known how to be happy. "Traitor," he told Wellington, but his voice had lost its edge, and his eyes remained fixed on Eleanor with an intensity that made her breath catch, and the moment stretched between them, suspended in the golden morning light, until Mrs. Thornton appeared in the doorway with fresh tea, and the spell shattered like glass, though Eleanor carried the warmth of it with her for the rest of the morning, carried the memory of his smile like a secret, pressed against her heart, and later, when she was reviewing the linen inventory with Mrs. Thornton, the housekeeper paused in her recitation of thread counts and said quietly, "The master hasn't smiled like that since he was a lad, your grace. Whatever you're doing, pray continue." And when Eleanor protested that she had done nothing at all, Mrs. Thornton's eyes crinkled with knowing warmth. "The master builds walls, your grace, but walls can come down. I've seen the way he looks at you when you're not watching. Give him time. He'll find his way to you. He simply needs to remember that he's allowed to want things for himself." The afternoon light was fading toward the soft gold of early evening when Eleanor returned to her private sitting room, her mind still pleasantly occupied with the household accounts she had been reviewing with Mrs. Thornton, and she was reaching for the door handle when she noticed that something had changed. Something subtle but unmistakable in the quality of the air that greeted her as she stepped across the threshold, and then she saw them. A crystal vase set upon the table by the window, where the last rays of sunlight could illuminate their perfect white petals. Camellias, a dozen of them at least, their waxy leaves gleaming dark green against the pale blooms, and the scent that rose from them stopped her breath in her chest, because it was the scent of her childhood, of her mother's garden, of summer mornings spent trailing after a woman whose gentle hands had taught her to appreciate the quiet beauty of growing things, and Eleanor stood frozen in the doorway with her hand pressed to her throat where the locket should have been, feeling tears prick unexpectedly at her eyes because she had mentioned them only once, only in passing. A brief comment, as they had walked past the conservatory nearly a week ago, something about how her mother had grown them, and how the fragrance reminded her of home, and she had not thought anyone was listening, had certainly not imagined that anyone would remember such an inconsequential detail, and yet here they were, these impossible flowers that spoke of attention and care, and something she dared not name. And before she quite knew what she was doing, Eleanor found herself walking through the corridors of Blackwell Manor toward Henry's study, her heart beating with a rhythm that had nothing to do with exertion. And when she reached his door, she knocked and entered at his gruff acknowledgement to find him seated behind his massive desk with papers spread before him and his dark head bent over correspondence. And when he looked up at her entrance, something flickered in those storm-grey eyes before his expression settled into its familiar guarded lines. And Eleanor said simply, "You remembered," and watched the slight tension gather in his shoulders, watched him set down his pen with deliberate care as he replied in that clipped tone she now recognized as his defense against feeling too much. "The gardener mentioned you admired them. It was nothing." But she saw the way he did not quite meet her eyes, saw the careful stillness of his hands upon the desk, and she understood with a certainty that settled warm and terrifying in her chest that it was not nothing, that it was in fact everything. And so instead of leaving as propriety suggested she should, Eleanor crossed to the chair by the fire where a familiar worn copy of Persuasion waited on the side table, and she settled herself there with the book in her hands and said quietly, "I thought I might read here for a while, if you do not mind the company." And Henry's pen remained still for a long moment before he answered, "I do not mind." And they passed the evening in a silence that was no longer awkward, but rather something approaching intimate. The crackle of the fire and the scratch of his pen, and the whisper of turning pages weaving together into a peace Eleanor had not known she was capable of feeling. And when at last she rose to leave, she paused at the door and turned back to find his eyes already upon her. And she said softly, "The camellias were my mother's favourite. She died when I was 16. I have not seen them since we left our home. Thank you, Henry." And she used his name deliberately, a gift offered in return for his own. And his eyes met hers with an intensity that stole her breath, and he said in a voice gone rough at the edges, "I remember everything you say." And the admission seemed to surprise him as much as it did her, and Eleanor carried those words with her as she walked back through the lamplit corridors to her sitting room, where the camellias waited, their fragrance filling the air with memories and promises. And she touched their petals with trembling fingers, and thought of her mother, and thought of Henry, and thought of the promise she had made to herself, not to love him, and wondered with a flutter of something that felt dangerously like hope, whether that promise had already begun to crumble beyond repair. Sleep had eluded her for hours, her mind turning over the events of recent weeks like stones in a riverbed, smoothing the edges of memories she found herself revisiting again and again, the warmth of his hand on her elbow in the library, the unexpected gift of camellias that spoke of an attention she had not dared to believe in, the way his eyes had softened when she used his name. And so Eleanor had risen from her bed and wrapped herself in a shawl against the chill of the autumn night, her bare feet silent on the cold floors as she wandered through the darkened corridors of Blackwell Manor, with no particular destination in mind, only a restlessness that would not be quieted. And it was this aimless wandering that brought her at last to the portrait gallery, a long room she had not yet explored, where tall windows admitted pale moonlight that fell in silver rectangles across the polished floor and illuminated the faces of generations past, men and women in the fashions of bygone eras who watched her passage with painted eyes that seemed almost alive in the shifting light. And she moved slowly along the gallery, studying each face for traces of the man she had married, finding his jaw in one ancestor, his height suggested in another, until she came to a portrait that stopped her breath in her chest. A woman, beautiful and serene, with dark hair swept up in an elegant style and eyes that were grey as storm clouds, grey as a winter sea, grey as the eyes that had watched her across the breakfast table that very morning. And Eleanor was so absorbed in studying this face that she did not hear the footsteps behind her until a voice spoke from the shadows, rough and low in a way she had never heard it before. "My mother," Henry said. And Eleanor turned to find him standing in the darkness just beyond the moonlight's reach, his face half hidden, his hands clenched at his sides. "She died when I was 12. A fever," they said. "She was well in the morning and gone by nightfall, and my father—" He stopped, his jaw tightening in that way she had come to recognize as his defense against feeling too much. "My father never recovered. He became cold, demanding. Nothing I did was ever enough. I could manage the estates flawlessly, and he would find fault. I could increase the tenants' yields, and he would criticize my methods. His last words to me were criticism of how I had handled a dispute with one of the farmers. He died still finding me wanting." And Henry's voice broke slightly on the last words, and Eleanor watched his hands slowly unclench as he continued speaking, as if he could not stop himself. Her name was Margaret. She smelled of rosewater. She used to sing to me when I could not sleep. After she died, the house felt empty in a way I could not explain, as if the walls themselves were grieving. And when he finally fell silent, Eleanor moved to stand beside him, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him despite the chill of the gallery, and she said simply, "Because I was here, and I was listening." And for a long moment they stood together in the moonlight, looking up at Margaret Blackwell's gentle painted face. And then Henry turned to Eleanor with eyes that were unguarded in a way she had never seen, stripped of their usual careful distance, and he said quietly, "She would have liked you. She valued kindness over status. She would have seen—" And he stopped, struggling with words that did not come easily to a man who had learned young that vulnerability invited only pain. "She would have seen you clearly," he finished at last, and Eleanor felt something shift between them, something profound and irreversible, and she understood that he had given her a gift more precious than camellias or comfortable silences. He had given her the truth of himself, and she would guard it carefully. The letter arrived on a grey morning, 6 weeks after the wedding, its crisp cream paper bearing the seal of a London hostess whose invitations were commands rather than requests, and Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face as Henry read its contents aloud across the breakfast table, his voice carefully neutral as he explained that the Hartwell family was hosting the final ball of the season, and that their attendance was not merely expected but required. For the Duke of Ashworth had not been seen in society since his sudden and mysterious marriage, and the ton was hungry for answers, and Eleanor's hand moved of its own accord to her throat, where the locket should have been, as memories crashed over her like waves against a shore. The Hartwell ballroom, with its glittering chandeliers, the whispers that had followed her through the crowd, Clarence's voice carrying across the room as he announced to anyone who would listen that he could not be expected to shackle himself to poverty. And she must have made some sound, because Henry's eyes sharpened, and he set down the letter, and said, in that clipped tone she now recognized as concern disguised as command, "You are pale. What is wrong?" And Eleanor forced herself to meet his gaze, and admitted in a voice that did not quite tremble that she had not attended a society event since her broken engagement, that the prospect of facing the ton filled her with a dread she could not quite articulate, that she feared the whispers and the stares and the possibility that Clarence himself might be there to witness whatever new humiliation awaited her. And Henry was silent for a long moment, his jaw tight, his storm-grey eyes darkening to something that looked almost like fury. And when he spoke, his voice was fierce in a way she had never heard it before. "You are the Duchess of Ashworth. You will enter that ballroom as my wife, and no one will dare question your place. You faced ruin with dignity, and you will face society the same way, and I will be beside you." And before she could respond, he had risen from the table and strode from the room, leaving Eleanor staring after him with her heart beating strangely fast, and within the week London's finest modiste had arrived at Blackwell Manor with bolts of silk and satin in every shade imaginable, and Eleanor found herself standing in the morning room, while measuring tapes circled her waist, and fabric samples were held against her skin, and Henry appeared in the doorway to observe the proceedings with an expression of grim satisfaction. And when he left, his hand brushed the small of her back in a gesture so brief she might have imagined it, except that her skin burned where he had touched her for hours afterward. And on the day before their departure for London, a carriage arrived bearing a gentleman whose easy smile and knowing eyes marked him immediately as someone who saw far more than he revealed, and Henry introduced him as Lord Thomas Wentworth, Earl of Weston, and his oldest friend, and Lord Thomas bowed over Eleanor's hand with exaggerated gallantry, and declared that Henry had understated her charms considerably, which earned him a quelling glare that seemed to delight rather than chasten him. And later that evening, Eleanor overheard them speaking in the library as she passed in the corridor, Lord Thomas's voice carrying clearly through the half-open door. "You do realize you have mentioned her 7 times in the past hour. Not that I am counting. I am absolutely counting." And Henry's response was too low to hear, but Eleanor saw through the gap in the door the faint colour rising on his cheekbones, and she pressed her hand to her own flushed cheek and continued down the corridor with a warmth spreading through her chest that felt dangerously like hope. The Hartwell townhouse blazed with light as their carriage drew up to the entrance, and Eleanor felt her heart hammering against her ribs with such force that she was certain Henry must be able to hear it, must be able to feel the tremor in her gloved hand where it rested on his arm. And she thought of the last time she had approached this house 2 years ago, wearing the pale blue gown she had chosen for her wedding trousseau, her heart full of foolish hope, and her head full of dreams that would shatter before the evening ended. And now here she was again, ascending these same marble steps. But everything was different. She was different. She was the Duchess of Ashworth. She wore a gown of deep emerald silk that rustled with every step and caught the light like something alive, and the man beside her was not the weak-chinned Viscount who had discarded her like yesterday's newspaper, but rather this tall, stern Duke whose presence seemed to part the crowd before them, like water before the prow of a ship. And yet, despite all of this, she felt the old fear rising in her throat as they entered the ballroom, and the whispers began, a susurrus of sound that followed them across the polished floor, and she caught fragments of it. "The Ashworth girl, you remember, the one Pemberton threw over. And a companion, I heard. Can you imagine? And however did she manage to catch the Duke?" And her hand moved involuntarily to her throat, reaching for the locket that was not there. But before her fingers could complete the gesture, Henry's hand covered hers where it rested on his arm, warm and steady and impossibly reassuring, and he murmured without looking at her, his voice pitched for her ears alone, "Chin up, they are beneath you." And something in his quiet certainty steadied her, allowed her to lift her chin and meet the curious stares with the dignity she had learned in the hardest of schools, and the evening proceeded better than she had dared to hope. Henry stayed close, a bulwark against the tide of speculation, introducing her to allies whose names she tried desperately to remember, people who owed him favours or feared his displeasure, and who therefore greeted her with warmth that might have been genuine or might have been calculated, but was welcome nonetheless. And Lord Thomas appeared at her elbow with a glass of champagne and outrageous gossip about a countess whose wig had caught fire at a dinner party, making her laugh despite herself, and she began to think that perhaps she could survive this, perhaps she could even triumph. And then she saw him across the room, and everything inside her went cold and still. Clarence Pemberton, older than she remembered, heavier, his golden hair thinning at the temples, and his waistcoat straining across a belly that spoke of too many rich dinners and too much port. But his eyes were the same, calculating and cruel, and they were fixed on her with an expression that made her stomach clench with remembered humiliation. And before she could prepare herself, he was crossing the ballroom toward her, his smile sharp as a blade, and he stopped before her and said in a voice pitched to carry to the avid listeners nearby, "Miss Ashworth, how unexpected to see you here. I had heard you had fallen on difficult times, reduced circumstances, was it not? A companion, I believe." And Eleanor felt the old shame wash over her like ice water, freezing her voice in her throat, and Clarence's smile widened as he pressed his advantage. "One does wonder how you managed to secure such an advantageous match. The Duke must be a charitable man indeed." And Eleanor's spine straightened despite her fear, her hand tightening on Henry's arm, and she opened her mouth to respond, though she did not know what words would emerge. But before she could speak, she felt Henry go utterly still beside her, still in the way of a predator sighting prey. And she knew with sudden certainty that Clarence Pemberton had made a very grave mistake. The silence that followed Clarence's words stretched for only a heartbeat, but in that heartbeat, Eleanor felt the weight of every stare in the ballroom pressing down upon her, felt the old familiar shame rising in her throat like bile, felt her hand move involuntarily toward the hollow of her throat where the locket should have been, and she opened her mouth to speak, though she did not know what words would emerge, what defense she could possibly mount against this man who had already destroyed her once before. But before any sound could pass her lips, Henry stepped forward, and the movement was so deliberate, so controlled, that the very air in the ballroom seemed to still, and when he spoke, his voice was ice, each word precise and devastating. "I made my wife a promise, Pemberton. I intend to keep it." And Eleanor watched as her husband proceeded to dismantle Clarence Pemberton with the surgical precision of a man who had been waiting for exactly this moment, his voice never rising above that cold, measured tone, as he spoke of gambling debts that were whispered about in every club in London, of investments that had failed so spectacularly that Clarence had been forced to sell his family's country estate, of a wife whose very public dissatisfaction was the subject of drawing-room gossip from Mayfair to Bath, and through it all Henry's hand remained steady on Eleanor's arm, anchoring her, protecting her, and she could smell the familiar scent of sandalwood and leather that she had come to associate with safety, as he continued, his storm-grey eyes fixed on Clarence's increasingly florid face. "My wife came to me with nothing but her dignity and her intelligence, and I consider myself the most fortunate man in England. You discarded a diamond because you could not see past its setting. Your loss, my gain." And the words struck Eleanor like a physical blow, not painful but stunning, because he had called her a diamond, had spoken of fortune and gain as though she were a treasure rather than a burden. And she was still reeling from this when Lady Sophia Pemberton materialized beside her, beautiful and bitter in her silk gown, and said in a voice pitched low enough that only Eleanor could hear, "You were fortunate, Miss Ashworth. You lost only your reputation. I lost my entire future to that man's promises." And then she was gone, gliding away across the ballroom floor, while Clarence stood sputtering, his face purple with rage and humiliation, stripped bare before the very society he had courted so assiduously, and the whispers that filled the ballroom now were not about Eleanor's disgrace, but about the Duke of Ashworth's obvious devotion, about Clarence Pemberton's spectacular fall, about how completely and thoroughly the tables had turned. And then Henry was leading her onto the dance floor as the orchestra struck up a waltz, his hand warm and sure at her waist, and she looked up at him as they began to move, and said in a voice that trembled despite her best efforts, "You did not have to do that." And his eyes met hers, dark and fierce and full of something she was afraid to name, and he said simply, "I promised you that no one would humiliate you while you bear my name. I keep my promises." And as they turned across the polished floor, his sandalwood scent surrounding her, and his hand tightening almost imperceptibly at her waist. Eleanor felt something crack open in her chest, something that had been locked away since that terrible night 2 years ago, and she knew with sudden, devastating certainty that she was in danger of breaking every promise she had ever made to herself about this man. The carriage wheels rattled over the cobblestones as they made their way through the lamplit streets of London, and Eleanor sat in silence, her gloved hands folded in her lap, her mind turning over the events of the evening like a jeweler examining a gem from every angle, trying to understand how something so unexpected could have come to pass. How the man sitting across from her in the darkness could have transformed from a practical arrangement into something that made her chest ache with feelings she had sworn never to permit herself again. And she stole glances at him through the shadows, at the hard line of his jaw, and the way his storm-grey eyes caught the flickering light from the passing street lamps. And she thought of how he had stepped forward when Clarence had tried to humiliate her, how his voice had gone cold as winter steel as he systematically dismantled the man who had once destroyed her, how he had called her a diamond, had spoken of fortune and gain, as though she were something precious rather than a burden he had acquired out of obligation, and the memory of it made her breath catch in her throat. Even now, made her pulse quicken in a way that frightened her with its intensity, because this was not what she had agreed to. This was not the safe and practical arrangement she had accepted in his study all those weeks ago. This was something far more dangerous, something that could shatter her completely if she allowed it to take root. And yet she could not stop herself from feeling it, could not stop the warmth that spread through her chest when he looked at her the way he had looked at her on that dance floor, as though she were the only person in the room, as though she mattered. And when the carriage finally drew to a halt before the townhouse, and Henry handed her down, his fingers lingering on hers a moment longer than necessary, she felt the touch like a brand even through her gloves. And they walked together through the quiet entrance hall and up the stairs, the silence between them thick with everything unspoken, and when they reached the door to her chambers they stood facing each other in the dim gaslight, neither quite ready to part, and Eleanor heard herself say, her voice unsteady in a way she could not control, "Thank you for everything you did tonight. You did not have to—" But before she could finish, he interrupted, his voice rough and low. "I wanted to. He hurt you. He deserved far worse." And his eyes were dark, intense, fixed on her face, with an expression that made her heart pound against her ribs, and she felt the pull between them like a physical force, like gravity, like something inevitable. And then slowly, so slowly, she could have stopped him if she wished, he reached out and touched her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone with a tenderness that stole her breath, and the scent of sandalwood and leather surrounded her, as he leaned close and said quietly, "You deserved better than what he did to you. You deserved to be cherished." And the word hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning, and then his jaw tightened and he stepped back, forcing himself away from her with visible effort, and he bid her good night in a voice that was not quite steady, and Eleanor stood frozen until she heard his footsteps retreat down the corridor, and only then did she let herself into her chamber and lean against the closed door, her hand pressed to her racing heart, the place on her cheek where he had touched her, still burning with the memory of his warmth, and she whispered into the darkness the admission she could no longer deny, "I promised I would not love him, God help me. I have broken that promise." The days that followed the ball passed in a strange, suspended state, as though the very air between Eleanor and Henry had been altered by what had transpired in that lamplit hallway, by the memory of his thumb tracing her cheekbone, and the word cherished hanging between them like a promise neither had quite dared to claim. And Eleanor found herself acutely aware of his presence in ways she had not permitted herself before, noticing how he appeared at breakfast earlier than had been his custom, how his gaze would find her across the morning room and linger there a moment too long before he looked away, how he seemed to manufacture reasons to be in whatever room she occupied, asking about household matters he had never before concerned himself with, inquiring after her opinion on fabrics for the drawing-room chairs that had been perfectly serviceable for a decade, and yet for all this increased attention he maintained a careful distance, as though he had drawn an invisible line between them that he would not cross. His hands clasped behind his back when he walked beside her, his voice measured and controlled, even as his storm-grey eyes betrayed something far less composed. And Eleanor did not know whether to be frustrated or touched by his restraint, did not know how to bridge the gap between what they had become and what she desperately hoped they might yet be. And so she watched him as he watched her, and the unspoken things between them grew heavy with waiting. Lord Thomas departed on the second morning, his carriage loaded and his farewells made with the cheerful efficiency of a man who had pressing business elsewhere. But before he climbed into his conveyance, he clasped Henry's hand with genuine warmth, and then turned to Eleanor with an expression that was surprisingly serious beneath his customary levity, and he said quietly, so that only she could hear, "Take care of him. He is not as invulnerable as he pretends, and he is happier than I have seen him in years. Whatever you are doing, do not stop." And then he winked, and was gone in a clatter of hooves and wheels, leaving Eleanor standing on the steps of the London townhouse, wondering exactly how much Lord Thomas Wentworth perceived, and whether it was written so plainly on both their faces that even a casual observer could read the truth. The journey back to Blackwell Manor began under grey skies that darkened as the afternoon wore on, and Eleanor sat across from Henry in the carriage watching the familiar countryside roll past, fields and hedgerows and villages she had come to know during her weeks as his Duchess. And she was thinking of how different this journey was from that first desperate night when a late autumn storm broke with sudden violence, rain lashing against the carriage windows and thunder rolling across the sky like a pronouncement, and she shivered involuntarily at the memory of huddling wet and terrified in this very carriage, of waking to find storm-grey eyes watching her with unreadable intensity. And Henry noticed, as he noticed everything about her now, and he said simply, "Cold?" And when she nodded, he rose from his seat and crossed to sit beside her, settling his coat around her shoulders as he had done that first night, the scent of sandalwood and leather enveloping her like an embrace. And his arm came to rest along the back of the seat behind her, not quite touching her shoulders, but close enough that she could feel his warmth. And he said quietly, his voice rough with something that might have been memory, or might have been longing, "I remember that night. You looked like a drowned kitten, fierce though, even terrified you were fierce." And Eleanor leaned into his warmth without conscious thought, watching the storm rage beyond the glass, and she understood with sudden crystalline clarity that this was what she had been searching for all along, not merely safety or security or protection from the world's cruelties, but this quiet comfort, this steady presence, this man who had seen her at her most desperate, and had offered her his coat and his name and something that felt terrifyingly like his heart. The week that followed their return to Blackwell Manor passed in a kind of exquisite torment, each day bringing Eleanor into Henry's presence, and each evening leaving her alone in her chambers, with nothing but the memory of his hand on her cheek, and the word cherished echoing through her restless dreams. And she found herself watching him with new eyes now, cataloguing every small gesture and fleeting expression, as though she might find in them some answer to the question that consumed her waking hours, some confirmation that what she had seen in his storm-grey eyes that night in the London hallway had been real, and not merely the product of her own desperate longing. But Henry had retreated behind his walls of courtesy and propriety with a thoroughness that left her aching with frustration, appearing at meals with perfect punctuality, and inquiring after her comfort with solicitous attention, and yet never quite meeting her gaze for longer than a moment, never allowing his hand to brush against hers when he passed her the salt-cellar, never sitting beside her in the evenings as he had begun to do before London. And Eleanor did not know whether to scream or weep, or simply shake him until he admitted what they both knew to be true. And so instead she wandered the manor like a ghost, unable to settle to her needlework or her correspondence or even the worn copy of Persuasion that sat reproachfully on her bedside table, its pages holding words about constancy and second chances that felt too close to her own heart to bear reading. It was Mrs. Thornton who finally spoke the truth aloud, finding Eleanor in the morning room staring out at the grey November sky, with her hand pressed unconsciously to the hollow of her throat where her mother's locket had once hung, and the housekeeper settled herself in the chair opposite with the comfortable familiarity that had grown between them over the past weeks, and said quietly, "The master builds walls, Your Grace. He has been building them since he was a boy, since his mother died and his father turned cold. But I have seen the way he looks at you when you are not watching, the way his eyes follow you across a room, the way he speaks your name as though it were something precious. He is afraid to hold too tightly. And I think he is afraid, not of you, but of wanting something so much it could hurt him to lose it. Give him time. He will find his way to you. He simply needs to remember that he is allowed to want things for himself." And Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes, because Mrs. Thornton had given voice to the hope she had been afraid to let herself feel. The hope that Henry's distance was not indifference, but its opposite, a desperate attempt to protect himself from the very feelings that were consuming her. That evening, when the sky had darkened to the colour of bruised plums and clouds had begun to gather on the horizon, promising yet another storm, Eleanor found herself drawn to the conservatory, as though pulled by invisible threads, and she stood among the white camellias that Henry had planted for her, their waxy petals gleaming in the fading light, and their sweet, familiar scent filling the humid air with memories of her mother's garden and her childhood home, and everything she had lost, and everything she had somehow impossibly found again. In this place she had never expected to call her own, and she touched the delicate blooms with trembling fingers, and thought of how he had remembered, how he had listened, how he had seen her in ways no one had seen her since before her father's disgrace. And she was so lost in her thoughts that she did not hear the door open behind her, did not sense his presence until his voice spoke her name, and she turned to find Henry standing among the flowers with something in his hands and an expression on his face that stole her breath entirely. Henry stood among the white camellias with something clutched in his hands, and Eleanor's breath caught in her throat at the sight of him, at the way the gathering darkness beyond the glass walls threw his features into sharp relief, at the tension visible in every line of his body, as though he were a man approaching a precipice from which there would be no retreat. And before she could speak, before she could ask why he had sought her out in this place that had become her sanctuary, the storm that had been threatening all evening finally broke with a violence that made the conservatory shudder, rain lashing against the glass in sheets, and thunder rolling across the sky like a pronouncement from the heavens themselves, and Henry flinched at the sound but did not look away from her, his storm-grey eyes fixed upon her face with an intensity that made her pulse quicken, and her hands tremble where they rested against the camellia petals. And he said in a voice that was rough and unsteady, in a way she had never heard from him, "I brought you here deliberately, to the flowers that remind you of your mother, to the place where you are most at peace, because what I have to say—" And he stopped, his jaw tightening, his hands gripping the small velvet box so hard his knuckles went white, and she saw with wonder that the great Duke of Ashworth, the man whose composure had never wavered in ballrooms or boardrooms or the face of public confrontation, was struggling to find words, was fighting against a lifetime of armor to speak what lay in his heart. And he tried again. "I am not good at this, Eleanor." And the sound of her name in his mouth, spoken with such tender desperation, made her eyes sting with tears she did not try to hide. And then he opened the box, and she saw what lay within. A delicate silver bracelet set with a single stone the colour of sea foam and winter skies, and he said quietly, "The colour of a winter sea, the colour of your eyes. I had it made weeks ago. I have been carrying it, waiting for—" And again he faltered, and she watched him gather himself, watched him force himself to stay, when every instinct must have been screaming at him to retreat behind his walls. And then he spoke words she recognized, words that pierced her to her very soul. "You pierce my soul. I am half agony, half hope. I do not know how to do this. I only know that I cannot imagine my life without you in it. Mrs. Thornton once told me I had forgotten I was allowed to want things for myself. She was right. I want you, Eleanor. I want you so much it terrifies me." And Eleanor felt the tears spill down her cheeks as she whispered, "I promised myself I would not love you. It is the only promise I have ever broken, and I cannot bring myself to regret it." And Henry's breath caught audibly, his eyes widening with something that looked like wonder and disbelief and desperate hope, all tangled together, and he breathed, "You love me." And the vulnerability in those 3 words broke something open in her chest, and she answered, "I love you. I think I have loved you since you wrapped your handkerchief around a child's doll and thought no one was watching." And then he was crossing the distance between them in 2 swift strides, and his hands were cupping her face, and his mouth was on hers, warm and searching and impossibly tender. And the storm raged against the glass, and the scent of white camellias surrounded them, and Eleanor felt the cool weight of the bracelet as he clasped it around her wrist without breaking the kiss, and she had never in her life felt more cherished, more seen, more completely and utterly at peace. The storm continued to rage beyond the glass walls of the conservatory as Eleanor lost herself in the warmth of Henry's embrace, his mouth moving against hers with a tenderness that made her heart ache and her knees weaken. And when at last they drew apart, it was only far enough for him to rest his forehead against hers, his breath unsteady, his hands still cradling her face, as though she were something infinitely precious that he feared might vanish if he released her. And she could feel the tremor in his fingers, could see the way his storm-grey eyes had softened to silver in the dim light, could smell the familiar scent of sandalwood and leather that she had come to associate with safety and home, and everything she had never dared to hope for. And he whispered her name like a prayer, like a promise, like a man who had spent his entire life building walls only to discover that the right person could walk through them as easily as sunlight through glass. And Eleanor reached up to touch his face, tracing the sharp line of his jaw, the corner of his mouth, marveling that she was allowed to do this now, that this stern and guarded man had opened himself to her so completely, and she said quietly, "I think I began to love you the night you gave me your coat in the carriage, though I did not know it then. I only knew that I felt safe for the first time in months, perhaps years, and I have felt safe with you ever since." And Henry turned his head to press a kiss to her palm, his eyes closing briefly, as though the gesture pained him in some exquisite way, and when he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "I have spent so long believing that wanting things only led to loss, that caring for someone meant giving them the power to destroy you. My father taught me that lesson well, though he never meant to. And when you came into my life, I told myself that this arrangement would be practical, sensible, that I would protect you because it was my duty and nothing more. But you undid me, Eleanor, with your quiet dignity and your grey-green eyes, and the way you laughed at my ridiculous dog as though joy was something you had forgotten you were capable of. And I found myself thinking of you constantly, noticing everything about you, wanting to give you things that would make you smile, wanting to stand between you and anyone who might hurt you. And I did not know what to call it until the night I watched Pemberton try to shame you, and I felt such rage that I could barely speak, and I knew then that I loved you, that I had probably loved you from the moment you looked at me in that carriage with such fierce dignity despite your terror, and your soaked gown, and your complete lack of options. And I have been carrying this bracelet for weeks, waiting for the courage to tell you, terrified that you might not feel the same, that I might have imagined the way you looked at me." And Eleanor silenced him with another kiss, softer this time, a kiss that spoke of promises and tomorrows, and all the years stretching before them. And when she pulled back, she touched the silver bracelet on her wrist, the grey-green stone catching the lamplight, and she said, "You see me, Henry, you have always seen me, and I will spend the rest of my life being grateful that I stumbled into your carriage on that rain-soaked night." And outside the thunder rolled, and the rain lashed against the glass, and inside the conservatory, surrounded by white camellias, and the scent of her mother's memory, Eleanor Ashworth finally understood what it meant to be cherished. The morning after their confession dawned clear and golden, the storm having spent itself in the night and left the world washed clean, and Eleanor woke to find the silver bracelet still clasped around her wrist, the grey-green stone catching the early light that streamed through her chamber windows, and for a long moment she simply lay there, touching the cool metal, and remembering the warmth of Henry's mouth on hers, the way his hands had trembled as he clasped the bracelet in place, the raw vulnerability in his voice when he had quoted Captain Wentworth's words and made them his own, and she wondered if perhaps she had dreamed it all until she heard a soft knock at her door and Mrs. Thornton entered with her morning tea, the housekeeper's eyes immediately finding the bracelet, and her weathered face breaking into a smile that spoke of 30 years of watching over Henry Blackwell and finally seeing him choose happiness. And the older woman said nothing, but her expression said everything, and Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks, even as joy bubbled up in her chest, like champagne. And when she descended to the breakfast room, she found Henry already there, standing by the window with Wellington at his feet. And he turned at her entrance, and his storm-grey eyes softened to silver the moment they found her face. And he crossed to her and took her hand and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, just above the bracelet. And the gesture was so tender, so different from the clipped formality of their early acquaintance, that Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes, and he said quietly, "I was afraid I had dreamed it." And she answered, "So was I." And his mouth curved into that rare, genuine smile that transformed his stern features, and they breakfasted together in a new kind of silence, one filled not with awkwardness or careful distance, but with the comfortable intimacy of two people who had finally spoken the truth that had been growing between them. And afterward, Henry took her hand and led her through the manor to the portrait gallery where his mother's painting hung in morning light, and he stood with Eleanor before it and said, "I want you to know her, as much as you can. I want to tell you everything about her, about the songs she sang, and the way she laughed, and how she would have loved you." And Eleanor leaned into his side and felt his arm come around her shoulders, solid and warm and real, and she thought of her own mother, of white camellias and childhood gardens, of all the losses that had led her to this moment, to this man who saw her clearly and chose her anyway, and she understood that grief and joy could exist together, that the heart was vast enough to hold both sorrow for what was lost and gratitude for what had been found. And when Henry pressed a kiss to her temple and murmured, "Thank you for listening, for staying, for loving me despite my walls," she turned in his arms and cupped his face in her hands and said, "Thank you for letting me in." And outside the gallery windows the autumn sun blazed golden over Blackwell Manor, and Eleanor Ashworth, who had once believed herself unworthy of love, finally understood that she had been worthy all along. The weeks that followed their confession unfolded like the pages of a story Eleanor had never dared to let herself imagine, each day bringing new discoveries about the man she had married and the life they were building together, and she found herself marveling at how completely everything had changed while remaining somehow exactly the same. For Blackwell Manor was still the grand estate, with its portrait gallery and its library and its conservatory full of white camellias, and Henry was still the stern-faced duke whose reputation made lesser men quiver. But now Eleanor knew the truth behind the facade. knew the way his storm-grey eyes softened to silver when he looked at her across the breakfast table, knew the sound of his rare laughter and the feel of his hand reaching for hers as they walked the grounds with Wellington padding faithfully at their heels. And she wore the silver bracelet always, the grey-green stone catching the light and reminding her with every glance that she was seen, that she was chosen, that she was cherished in exactly the way she had once believed impossible, and the household staff seemed to bloom under the warmth that now filled the manor's halls. Mrs. Thornton's knowing smiles appearing more frequently as she observed the master and mistress together. And one afternoon the housekeeper found Eleanor in the sitting-room, arranging fresh camellias in a vase, and said quietly, "I told you he would find his way to you, Your Grace. I told you he simply needed to remember he was allowed to want things for himself." And Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes as she replied, "You were right, Mrs. Thornton. You were right about everything." And the older woman patted her hand with the familiarity of someone who had watched over this family for 30 years, and said, "He is not the only one who deserved happiness. If I may say so, you have brought light back into this house, light I was not certain I would ever see again." And Eleanor thought of Henry's mother, Margaret, whose portrait hung in the gallery, whose grey eyes, so like her son's, seemed to watch over them with approval, and she understood that in loving Henry she had become part of something larger than herself, part of a legacy of love and loss, and the courage to try again despite the pain. And that evening when Henry found her in the library reading her worn copy of that beloved novel by the fire, he sat beside her and drew her close and pressed a kiss to her temple and murmured against her hair, "I never knew it could be like this. I never knew that wanting something so desperately could lead to having it, could lead to this peace." And Eleanor leaned into his warmth, breathing in the familiar scent of sandalwood and leather and wood smoke that she would forever associate with safety and home, and she said, "Neither did I, but I am grateful every day that I stumbled into your carriage on that rain-soaked night, grateful that you saw me when I had forgotten I was worth seeing." And Henry's arms tightened around her, as outside the windows the autumn evening settled soft and golden over Blackwell Manor, and Eleanor Ashworth, who had once promised herself she would not love this man, found that the breaking of that promise had led her to everything she had ever wanted. The years that followed their confession unfurled like the petals of the white camellias that bloomed each spring in the conservatory, each season bringing new joys that Eleanor had once believed impossible for a woman who had known such sorrow. And as she stood now in the garden of Blackwell Manor, watching her children play beneath the ancient oak tree, she marvelled at how completely her life had transformed from that rain-soaked night when she had stumbled into a stranger's carriage with nothing but her dignity and her desperation. For now she was surrounded by abundance in every form that mattered, not merely the material comforts of her position as Duchess, but the deeper riches of a love that had grown stronger with each passing year, a love that showed itself in the way Henry still watched her across crowded ballrooms as though she were the only woman in the room, in the fresh camellias that appeared in her sitting-room without fail, in the way his storm-grey eyes softened to silver whenever their daughter Margaret, named for his mother, climbed into his lap and demanded a story, and their son Robert, named for Eleanor's father, had inherited his mother's grey-green eyes and his father's stubborn jaw. And watching Henry teach the boy to ride with patient tenderness made Eleanor's heart ache with a gratitude so profound it sometimes stole her breath, for this was the man the world called cold and forbidding, this man who knelt in the grass to examine a butterfly with his children, who still reached for Eleanor's hand beneath the dinner table, who had kept every promise he had ever made to her and given her so much more than safety. And she touched the silver bracelet at her wrist, worn smooth now from years of constant wear, the grey-green stone still catching the light like a fragment of the winter sea. And she remembered Mrs. Thornton's words from so long ago about walls coming down and masters finding their way, and the dear woman had lived to see it all, had held both children as infants, and wept with joy, had finally retired to a cottage on the estate where Eleanor visited her weekly with flowers and news, and sometimes when Eleanor walked through the portrait gallery, she paused before the painting of Henry's mother Margaret, and whispered her thanks, for she felt certain that somewhere, somehow, the woman who had valued kindness over status was watching over them all. And when Henry appeared at her side now in the garden, sliding his arm around her waist and pressing a kiss to her temple as their children shrieked with laughter, and Wellington's successor, a young hound named Arthur, bounded after them through the autumn leaves, Eleanor leaned into her husband's warmth and breathed in the scent of sandalwood and leather and wood smoke that would forever mean home. And she thought of storms and shelter, of promises kept and promises broken, of the terrified woman she had been and the cherished wife she had become. And she understood at last that every loss had led her here, to this garden, to this man, to this life she had never dared to dream. And when Henry murmured against her hair, "Happy, my love," she turned in his arms and cupped his face in her hands and answered with all the truth in her heart, "More than I ever imagined possible." And the autumn sun blazed golden over Blackwell Manor as Eleanor Blackwell, Duchess of Ashworth, stood in the embrace of the man who had seen her clearly from the very beginning and knew herself to be exactly where she belonged.